Hello there, I'm Sean Briggs, and in this video I'm going to be walking you through the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. In this video you can see the optional battery grip along with the electronic viewfinder shown fitted throughout the video. Blackmagic have designed this camera as a cine camera, with many of the features typically found on mainstream cinema cameras. This is a cine camera designed for portability. What is really nice about this camera is the price point. It's relatively low for what you actually get out of this. You definitely get a lot of bang for buck out of working with this camera. It's an EF mount as well, so you can use all of your Canon lenses, and there's a variety of other lenses as well that are also in EF mount as well, so that's really good for working with this body. It's a Super 35mm sensor built into here, and compared to the other pocket cinema camera models that have come before this, this is certainly a pretty beefy upgrade. So first things first, we've got our on and off switch just next to where the EVF mount is. You just flick that and obviously the camera will turn on, flick it the other way and the camera will turn off. Then we've got our record button where you would more or less expect it to be. You've also got a secondary record button on the indent of this grip. I guess if you're holding it really tightly at a weird angle, you might want to use this one instead. It's considerably smaller. I would say not the easiest to get to, but there it is in case you need an alternative. And then just on the front of the grip itself, you've got this little rotating dial, which is, you know, what more or less what you come to expect from any camera these days, really, when you want to control your aperture, your shutter speed, or your ISO. This is the dial you'll use to control all of those, because it's the only one that is on this body. The default it's set to is aperture control, but if you want to alter your ISO, shutter speed, or white balance, you have buttons clearly labeled for switching those around. So what you do is you'll press one of these buttons, say ISO, and now the wheel will control your ISO, so you can go up and down in your ISO settings. Hit the S button and that is your shutter, so now you can alter your shutter speed, and finally with your white balance you can basically cycle through your different white balance settings with that too. You'll also find that next to the video record button you've also got a little camera button, and that's because this camera can also take stills. They are 21.2 megapixel stills, but still, if you're shooting on the fly and you need to take any stills at all, then you do have that button there to take them for you. And then coming away from that part, we've now got our function buttons. We've got 3 of these, and they do have defaults already set in them. The first function button is default set to false color. So just by pressing it once, you're toggling false color on, press it again, false color comes off. False color is really good for basically checking your exposure levels. You've got a meter on the left of the LCD monitor for you, so you can see what each color represents in terms of exposure. So obviously going into the yellows and the reds, you're going into high exposure. Coming down to the blues and the purples, that is low exposure. So it's very good as a function to help you basically just check quickly what your exposure is looking like. Just toggle it on and off. The second function button is your LUT View Assist. So you can just toggle that on and off. If you're shooting in a log profile at all, then you have this button here to switch it into LUT View Assist. And it's just really handy to have that available so that you can see what your colors are going to look like in the edit when you come to grading. And finally, the third function button is default set to a guide of where your letterboxing will cut off your frame. So if you're shooting something with the intention of cropping in and making it more of like a kind of anamorphic visual, then you do have this available to you as well. And now getting into some of the more fun stuff, an addition that the 6K Pro has over the other pocket cinema cameras is that it's now got built-in NDs, and it goes up to 6 stops of ND filtering. So just by pressing either the plus or the minus, you will then start cycling through the different ND filters. So really good for shooting outdoors in bright sunlight, or if you want to shoot with your lens wide open and you don't want to overexpose your image, so you can incorporate these ND filters in order to get your perfect image. And of course you can use that false color as well to make sure that everything's exposed correctly. Now, where your thumb would naturally rest on the grip of this camera, you have both an iris button and a focus button. For the focus button, if you hold it in and you make sure that whatever you want in focus is within the little box on the screen, then you just let go, and then your camera should focus over to what it is that is in that box. And then here you've got your HFR button, which stands for high frame rate. So using this button, you can toggle in and out of high frame rate mode. Then you've got your zoom button, which just zooms in digitally on your image, and then you can manually focus in on whatever it is that you're looking at. It just gives you a closer look so you can make sure that those edges are sharp. And then beneath that, you've got this little burger sign, which is your menu button. So by pressing into that, it'll take you into the menu. And just to finish off with the buttons, below that is our playback button. So by pressing that, you go into the memory that you've recorded that day, and you can start playing things back to see that you've got all the shots that you need, or to check if any of the shots you got are good in case you want to retake them. So that's all the buttons. Now we're just going to have a look on the side of the camera so we can see our inputs and outputs. Standard requirement of any camera these days, you've got a 3.5mm jack input for a microphone, and you've also got a 3.5mm output for your headphones so you can monitor your audio. Just below that, you've got a full HDMI connection. So if you want to use any external monitors or use an external recorder, then you can do so through this port right here. And then below that, we have a USB-C connection, which is really good because what we can use this for is not only offloading memory from the camera if we're using SD cards or CFast cards, but we can also use this to output whatever it is we're recording into an external SSD drive. Because this camera is compatible with SSDs, you can essentially use an SSD as a memory card. You don't necessarily have to buy memory cards for this camera in order to record with it. You can just connect with an SSD drive. I use a Samsung T5 drive, and that works wonders. Shooting Blackmagic RAW as well, I wouldn't really record with anything else in this camera unless you just didn't want to have any attachments on your camera at all. Or if you already had the CFast cards or the SD cards, then you might as well just use them anyway. But the flexibility of being able to use an SSD drive like this with this camera as basically a memory unit directly out of the camera into that is actually amazing. Because imagine if you got like a 1 terabyte drive with this and you're shooting like a Blackmagic RAW full quality, like minimal compression, you're going to need a lot of memory space in order to record with that. What I would recommend though is that if you are thinking of doing anything like that, just check with the manufacturer on their store page or talk to them directly, like contact support or something, to figure out which drive it is you need in order to do that. Because I know that some drives aren't compatible with the kind of higher data output recording modes, whereas the lower ones like 12/1 is generally fine. Coming back to the inputs and outputs, we have 2 mini XLR inputs. So we have 2 of those, which is great, but they are mini, which is a bit unusual because there's not a lot of like mini XLR cables out there. So what I would probably recommend you do is you get a mini XLR to full XLR adapter. Blackmagic distribute these as well. So yeah, if you look on the WEX store page, I'm sure you'll find them there. And finally, we've got our power input here, 12 volts. So if you've got any V-Lock batteries or like a Titan base external battery or anything like that, then it's a really good pairing with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro. An additional benefit, as well as like the inbuilt ND filters that the 6K Pro has over the previous generations of the Pocket Cinema camera, is that you can get this accessory, which is the EVF. So if, say, you're in broad daylight and it's really hard to view your monitor, with a lot of cameras it's really handy having that EVF so you can see what you're doing. This is an accessory that you can attach and detach as you like, so you don't have to have it on here all the time, but really it's quite snug in there, so I don't see why you wouldn't if you've got it. And you also get this battery grip at the bottom, which can just extend the battery life of this camera. I know in the previous generations the battery life wasn't that great. This now uses the NPF batteries, which extends the battery life, but also with this battery grip you can put 2 additional NPF batteries in here, which then you attach to the bottom of this, which means you could be running this on 3 NPF batteries, which greatly improves the battery life of this camera and just well, allows you to continue recording for longer without having to be interrupted by low power or anything like that. So that pretty much covers all the externals of this camera. It's very simplistic in nature, this camera all round, which you're also going to find out that the menu system is equally as so. So we're going to jump into the menu now. I'm just going to press the little burger button that I showed you guys earlier and it will bring up the menu straight away. Our first stop on the menu system is our codec and quality and resolution stuff, so we can select how we want to film our video. So first things first, I'm going to start with ProRes. This is a touchscreen display as well. Very nice, very easy. Everything's laid out. Everything on screen is basically what you have access to, and whatever you don't have access to for whatever particular combination of options you have selected, the things that aren't usable or compatible with those options will be grayed out. So given that that makes sense, we have the choice between Blackmagic RAW or ProRes for our recording codecs. We're going to start with ProRes, mainly because ProRes is basically the more compressed codec out of the two, and from that we've got ProRes HQ, ProRes 422, ProRes LT and ProRes Proxy. Now HQ is the highest quality, hence HQ, that's kind of what it abbreviates to, is high quality. 422 is just a little bit below that, LT a little bit below 422, and then Proxy is our most compressed quality out of the lot of those. And in ProRes as well, if I just switch it to LT, because that's what I would normally shoot at for my sort of filmings, 422 and HQ you would more use for productions where you know you're going to be heavier in the grade, or you know that you just want the quality to be better for whatever kind of online transcoding that might happen, depending on where you're distributing it basically. So HQ is obviously going to be a bigger file size, whereas Proxy down at the bottom here, it's nice that they're in this kind of like ascending or rather descending order. Proxy is going to be the smallest file size, so you might also want to take into consideration which of these you are using, depending on what kind of storage space you have available to you. And with ProRes, if I just put it into LT, because that's what I would normally shoot at, as I've already said, you have the options between 4K DCI, UHD, which is 4K, but just a little bit less than 4K DCI, which is also referred to as 4K Cine or Cine 4K. And then lastly, we have Full HD 1920 by 1080. With ProRes, the highest resolution recording is 4K. But the sensor does capture the full 6K image, which is down converted to give the 4K recording. This does then in turn mean that your 4K image is better quality because it is downsampling from that full 6K image. If you want to be using the full extent of your 6K sensor and record a 6K video file, then you need to use Blackmagic RAW. If you are in love with shooting RAW and want all of your videos to be in the RAW format, which is, as I understand online, is a highly sought after codec to be filming in for anyone's like indie films, music videos, or even sometimes corporate videos, but definitely high-end commercial shooting or high-end feature film production. So with Blackmagic RAW, you now have access to a bunch of other resolutions. So now you've got 6K, you've got another version of 6K, which is just a slightly more cine cropped version of 6K. You've also got 3.7K anamorphic, so very good for your anamorphic lenses. You've got 2.8K, you've got 5.7K, and you've got 4K DCI. Coming over to our quality control options for Blackmagic RAW. So we have constant bitrate, which, you know, basically it just keeps the bitrate constant for you, so it's a little bit more consistent in terms of how it compresses your video. And then constant quality is where it more prioritizes the quality of the overall video that we are getting. So if we start with constant bitrate, we have the options from, it's descending order again, same as with ProRes. We've got 3:1, we've got 5:1, when it would listen to me, we've got 8:1, and we've got 12:1. So 12:1 is the most compressed, and then 3:1 is the least compressed. And because you're shooting in Blackmagic RAW, shooting in 3x1 is going to eat up a lot of memory. So if you do want to be shooting in the fullest quality possible in 6K as well, of course you can also reduce your resolution to save on memory space as well if you would like to, but I mean realistically you're not going to be shooting in 3x1 very often. You're probably more likely going to be shooting in 12x1, which is still perfectly acceptable in the field. It still gives you a very good image. It is the most compressed out of your quality options here, but it is still very good. You've still got Blackmagic RAW and you can still grade it to with great result. But you also have the option of 8x1 and 5x1 if you would like to go for something a little bit punchier, but still staying away from 3x1 to save on memory space. And then constant quality, now it's Q0, Q1, Q3 and Q5. Again, this is a descending order of quality. So Q0 is going to be the highest quality, where there's going to be basically, well, zero compression pretty much, more or less, and then you know, 1, 3 and 5 being the most compressed and 1 and 3 being the in-between options between 0 and 5 in this. So yeah, and that's basically how you set up your codec and your quality and your resolution. It's all just by touch, which is great because it means if you need to make quick changes, at least you can see all the options that you have available to you straight away as soon as you go into the menu system, and that is in the record part of the menu as well. As you can see from these little dots at the bottom, that basically indicates that we have 2 additional pages other than this one in the record part of the menu. So if we use the little arrows on the side, we can go left, we can go right. In this case, we're going to go right again to page number 2. And here we can see our dynamic range options. We can see our project frame rate options. We can see our off-speed recording. We can toggle that on or off. And basically what that is referring to is your HFR mode, which is a button that you have on the body of the camera to toggle it on and off. So by pressing that, you're also toggling it on and off as I'm doing right now. And basically your off-speed recording is your slow motion frame rate recording. So as you can see, it says 50 FPS here, but still 25, but still 25 FPS here. That's because when we're recording in slow motion, it will still play back as 25 frames per second, which means that we'll be at a, you know, ×2 slow motion. And just by touching these arrows here, we can ramp it up until it maxes out and then goes back down to like 5 FPS. So with this 5 FPS at 25 frames per second, we're basically getting a fast motion option here as well. So at 5 FPS, basically what you'll be seeing is a sort of time-lapse effect that is being recorded in 25 FPS. So when you come to play back in the camera's memory or on your computer in your editing software, it will play back as a sort of time lapse. It's not the fastest time lapse you could probably get from other options, but at least the option is there in case you wanted to capture that in this kind of, you know, the Blackmagic RAW sort of format. Another thing about the frame rate control as well is that it's also dependent on what resolution you're filming at as well. So if I could bring ourselves back over to our codecs and resolution options, if I go from 6K and I set it to 2.8K and I go back over, I can now go down and it's now 120 FPS slow motion. So you do have to lose some resolution to max out on your slow motion options for this. Otherwise you kind of max out at 60p, 50p, depending on what region that you're using this camera in. But 120 FPS is the highest frame rate that you can get. And to say that you can preset this and then toggle it on and off is very handy at the switch of a button, which is really, really nice to have. Your dynamic range options up here, we've got video, we've got Ext video. I don't really know what that stands for. External video, I'm not really sure. And then we've got film. Video is basically the equivalent of a Rec 709 picture profile in this camera. And then film is basically their log profile. So like your S logs, your V logs, your C logs, all that kind of stuff. So this is the one where you get the highest dynamic range. And then X video is basically just between these two. So it's kind of like a little bit of 709, a little bit of log. It's kind of like a halfway between the two of those. At the bottom here, preferred media for recording. So this is referring to where would you like your video to be recorded to. So of course, this is a CFast card compatible camera. It's also an SD card compatible camera, and it is a USB recording compatibility camera. I'm not really sure how to phrase that, but basically this is the option you want if you're going to be using an external drive of any kind. So if you're using the Samsung T5 1 terabyte solid state drive that I mentioned earlier, then this is the option that you want to go with. So these are your main options for where you would like to record to, basically. Coming over to page 3 in this camera, we now have the options of a proper time lapse. So this is your way into getting a much faster time lapse, or a hyperlapse, or whatever phrasing that you would like. By going into this part of the menu, this is how you get it. 20 seconds, wow. 30 seconds, wow. 40 seconds, how long? 50 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. Wow, it just keeps going. 10 minutes. And then to 2 frames. So if you wanted a slower time lapse, one that's more true to life-ish, it's not really though, is it? Then this is where you get those controls. And just by having this switched on, once you go to record your time lapse, these are the settings that you will have. We also have detail sharpening that you can toggle on and off at the touch of a button, and you can also apply how much detail sharpening you would like to apply. I would recommend keeping it low, because this is like a digital sharpening, so it's not always the best quality, but depending on what sort of lenses you're using or what kind of image that you like to come out with your video, you might want to use this, but personally I don't use it that often. And then down here, if card drops any frames, you have the option of it stopping recording, or you can set it to alert, whereby it will alert you that it's dropped a frame, but it won't interrupt your recording. Say that if what you're recording is actually quite important, if it's like a once in a lifetime recording of something, say like that flamingo landed on that mountain at the perfect time, and you don't want to miss that just because you're dropping frames, then maybe you just want your camera to tell you that it's dropping frames as opposed to interrupting your shot. And you also have the option to apply LUT in file. So basically, if you would like to shoot in the film picture profile, and then you want and you've got a LUT pre-installed on this camera, one that you've made maybe, or one that you've downloaded from online, or maybe you like the one that is already built into the Blackmagic, then you can set apply LUT in file, and then it'll burn that LUT into the final file for you, so that when you come to editing it, it'll already have that LUT applied to it, saving you time in your grade, I suppose. But I'll generally like the flexibility in post, just in case my client isn't happy with the way that with the kind of LUT that I'm using. Right, so next up, monitor. So now we have control over our monitor settings. This is the monitor, in case you were wondering what the monitor is. But we do have control over more than just this LCD screen, because we actually have 3 ways of monitoring our video through this camera. So we've got the LCD, which is this screen right here. This is the LCD, the touchscreen LCD. And then we've also got the HDMI, which is the HDMI output going to our external monitors if we'd like, or whatever. And we also have the viewfinder, which is our EVF accessory that we've got installed onto the top of this camera right here, the little eyepiece thingy. And by going through here, you might notice that some of the settings change here and there. That's because when we apply settings, with any of these, whether it's clean feed, display LUT, display zebras, focus assist, false color, all that stuff, it'll only apply it to these. So say you've got an external monitor and you would like it to constantly show your false color, so you can see your exposure at all times, as well as any grids or frame guides or whatever, then you can have that second monitor to help you get the right exposure and the right composition at the right time. And then when you go back over to your LCD, it'll have a different array of settings. So you'll basically be viewing different types of the same image basically, which might sound like a very busy way to work as a videographer, but I suppose in certain fields of work, this might actually be very useful. Say like you're staking out on a safari and you're filming wildlife or something in high exposure conditions, like you're filming some lions or something. You might want a couple of monitors so you can check your exposure just by looking to the left slightly and then back to your main monitor just to, you know, see the actual image as is. And obviously you can apply the same to your viewfinder as well, just in case it's so bright you can't actually see any of your monitors. You might want to use that eyepiece so you can actually see what you're doing. So coming over to page 2 of monitor, same rules apply. LCD, HDMI and viewfinder, these all work more or less independently of each other, so you can have different settings for each one. Status text, display meters, display codec and resolution. So this is kind of like what you're going to see on your screen. It's basically the HUD of your LCD monitor basically. That's what this is displaying for you. And anamorphic squeeze, if you're using any anamorphic lenses, you can apply a 1.33 times squeeze. So that's something that you can view on your monitor, so that instead of seeing a very stretched image, you'll be seeing it as you will be you know, eventually seeing it in your edit when you apply that squeeze in post. And you know, as I said, it applies independently of each of these LCD, HDMI and viewfinder. Coming over to page 3 of monitor. Again, independent. It's fantastic. It's so flexible. We can apply our intensity of zebras here by percentage. So like, you know, what's the threshold at which it's going to see you know, high exposures. We can also have our peaking, whether, you know, colored lines even, and then focus color. So for our peaking, we can set what color we'd like to see that at. Generally speaking, red is a good color to have it set at. You basically want something that you don't see in a lot of images. Red is quite a visible one, quite striking, and focus assist level, you can, you know, drag it up and down. You can have high assistance or low assistance, or just in the middle, which is where this is default set to, I believe. And then coming over to page 4 of monitor, now we're looking at frame guide, safe area guide, guides opacity, guides color, and then we've got our different types of you know, grids here as well. We've got, you know, the rule of thirds grid, we've got the horizon grid, you've got a crosshair, you've got a dot. You can't seem to have all of them on at the same time, but it seems that what you can have is that you can have thirds on with horizon, crosshair and dot, which does make sense because grids is, you know, your rule of thirds is actually, it serves a different purpose to these ones. Rule of thirds is more for your composition assistance, whereas your horizon, crosshair and dot is more for aligning your shot in the right way. And now coming over to page 5 of monitor. This is basically just LCD brightness now. You know, I've had to set it quite low so I can actually record this screen and you still be able to see what is going on without it basically just being like a big blown out mess. But, you know, depending on what shooting conditions you are in, you might want to have a dimmer screen. You might want to have a much brighter screen if you are shooting outdoors and it is a very sunny day. And that is our monitor controls in the menu system. So now we can come over to audio. So with audio, it's very simple. Again, we've got our channel, we've got 2 separate channels here, left and right, and we can control how high our audio levels are. We can even make them different if you wanted to, say, have a lower level and a higher level for the same microphone. Say that someone's prone to being very quiet one moment but then very loud the next. You might want to have left and right on different levels so that one can peak whereas the other one is still safe, and one of them has good audio level still while the other one probably has a very low audio level, which is not as helpful to us. We can also set phantom power on or off just at the touch of a button on screen. But yeah, very good for obviously if you're using external microphones that require a phantom power. You can just toggle this on and off and away you go. And channel sources, you do have options. You can, I've got it set at the moment to XLR1 and XLR2. So those are the two mini XLRs that we have on the side of our camera that I showed us earlier. But if you weren't using those XLRs at all, you do have other options as well. You've got the 3.5mm jack, which is just above the headphone port, so you can set that to right if you want, and then have XLR1 running. But then equally, you can have the camera internal microphone on mono, or you can have it, you know, just on the right. You have loads of options for audio. You can even just deactivate them if you want to. But yes, very, very useful. Just being able to switch these around to any combination that you would like and control those levels independently of each other so that you can get the best quality audio possible through this camera. And now over to page 2 of audio. Now we have our audio metering options here. We have some different decibel options here. I'm not an audio engineer, so I won't be able to advise on which of these is the best to use. What I would recommend is that you either go online and figure out which of these would be most suitable to you. I'd probably have it set at like ppm -18, because that's what jumps out at me as something that's familiar, and -18 I think would be a nice safe area to be recording at without the audio hitting a ceiling and distorting or anything like that. We also have our headphone volume controls here, as well as our speaker volume controls. So this obviously applies to when we come to play back our video files in camera. This is the speaker volume that you'll be getting, and obviously headphone volume is probably for the playback as well, but definitely for when you are monitoring your audio. So just set this to a comfortable level. Oops. So just set this to a comfortable level for your ears, and then you'll be able to hear what is going on. Moving over to the next section of the menu, we now have setup. So with setup, it's just your dates and times. You can set like what your date and time is here. You can set what language you'd like the whole thing to be at. Obviously, I've got it set to English because I am not bilingual. I only speak and read English. You do have a range of different languages, as you can see here, but I'm going to leave it on English, otherwise I'm going to get lost. You also got a choice between shutter angle and shutter speed. Shutter angle is something that is probably more familiar to filmmakers who are in the field shooting feature films, say like at Disney or Universal Studios or wherever, you know, Fox, which is now Disney. They will probably be shooting in shutter angle, but really it's down to what you're familiar with. So shutter speed is here if you've come from a DSLR mirrorless camera background and you're more familiar with that. And then you also have your flicker-free shutter based on. I've never seen it phrased like that, but basically that's your 50 Hertz and your 60 Hertz. 50 Hertz is your pal. It's not your buddy, it's your pal. So 50 Hertz is what we will be using in the UK, and 60 Hertz is generally NTSC, which is what they use in the United States, and it's generally just to, you know, hold off on that flicker when you're filming into certain lights due to the power grids. This is in sync with the power grids, so you don't get that flicker. And then display ND, so you have a choice of how you would like to see your ND filters, like which one that you've actually had applied. You can have it by the ND number, or you can have it by how many stops it's going to apply in darkness, filtration, or whatever, and then fraction, so how much it's going to be cutting the light by. I don't have any preference really. I really just look at which ND I've got applied, and I just kind of think to myself, is my shot exposed? And then if it's exposed the way I'd like it, then generally I'm happy. I don't really mind which ND I'm using for that. So now coming over to page 2 of setup. So now here's our function buttons that I showed us earlier. We've got F1, F2 and F3. F1 is set to false color. As you can see here, we can now change what that is. We can set it to focus assist. We can set it to frame guide, display LUT, status text, clean feed, nothing. It can be a record button if you like. It can be color bars, off-speed rec, which is, you know, basically slow and fast motion if you like, Safe area guide, grids, zebras, and back to false color. I would leave it at false color because false color is probably the most useful visual reference you can get for exposing your shot correctly. So I would just advise leaving false color where it is. And now coming over to F2, if we highlight F2, now it goes to display LUT because that's what its default set to. And again, we can change what that is at our leisure, depending on how we would like to work. I think having display LUT is good because if you are not sure on what the colors are going to look like in your frame because you're shooting in the log profile, then applying the LUT quickly just to get a peek at what that might look like in post is actually quite a valuable thing. And then F3 is our frame guides. So, you know, with this one, you could probably just change it to whatever you like. You might want zebras. You might want another false color button because false color is so helpful. You might want grids. I'm just going to leave it at frame guides for now, because if you are looking to crop in to your 16:9 video to give it more of an anamorphic look, then having these guides there might actually be quite helpful to you. And just over here, as you can see, we've got LCD HDMI and viewfinder as we had on the monitor part of the menu. So what this is doing is basically if I want to say not see my frame guides on HDMI, I just deselect that. And then when I go to like F1, obviously HDMI still apply to that because I want to see the false color everywhere. Or maybe I just want to see it on my LCD and nowhere else, because maybe I've got a director looking over my shoulder and he's got his own monitor to look at and I don't want it to be bleeding into what he's seeing because, you know, he's not interested in the exposure really. That's my job as the DOP or the camera operator or whatever your title is. But I will leave that there just for now. But yeah, perfect control over these options, very handy and very user-friendly. Coming over to page number 3 of setup. I don't have the controller for this, so I can't actually show you what this menu offers, but basically this is where you would come to set up your rocker directional, you know, hand grip accessory if you had it available to you. Page 4 of setup, you have a focus demand controller. So this is where you would kind of control whether you want it normal or reverse. I guess that's a case of like which way do you want it to focus in direction, depending on which way that you turn the focus ring. And coming over to page 5, you can control your tally light. So you can control whether or not you actually want it to be showing, because I know in some instances you might not want anyone to know that you're recording. So maybe you want the tally light to be off. And you can also set like an intensity of brightness, because maybe in some cases, say you're shooting like a live multi-camera production with a presenter or something, and then maybe you need that tally light to communicate to your presenter which camera they need to be speaking to. So that's really the only application I could imagine for this, unless you do just like to really intimidate whoever is hosting your video by just having a very bright tally lamp on to go, we are recording now. And then you've got auto dim. This is when your camera is idle for any amount of time. At what point do you want your camera to basically go into power saving mode and just dim the lights a bit to save on battery life? And down here, hardware ID. This is like your firmware version. Playback, do you want it to play all clips or single clips? So this would be very good if you're like offloading to a broadcaster. I know sometimes with ingest, they like to record in things from the camera, so you could set it so that it plays back everything in your memory card in one go without you having to do anything. So you just basically hook it up to whatever method you're using to get it to ingest, and then it'll offload it to ingest. They just hit record their end, and then they take in all of your footage, which automatically then transcodes it into whatever format they've set it to, which can be very handy for just getting it into the post-production process in a format that is helpful to everybody. Right, and then off to page number 6 of setup. So Bluetooth name. So you want to switch your Bluetooth on. This is how you're going to connect to things like the hand grip and the follow focus accessories, I imagine. And also if you want to like connect it to your phone or anything, if you want to use your smartphone as a monitor, then this is the Bluetooth name that you're going to be wanting to look out for. No device is currently connected to this camera. Yep, I'm not connecting my phone to it. This is a rental, but that's how you gain access to that. And then page number 7 for setup. If you are renting from a loan store or borrowing it from a friend or anything like that, then if someone has set like really weird settings on this camera and you want it to be the factory default, then reset camera is the way to do that. I mean, it literally says factory reset right there. So, I mean, that's kind of self-explanatory as well. And you can also do motion sensor calibration, and you can do LCD white balance calibration for the LCD. So if you feel that the tint on this monitor here is a little bit off, then you can calibrate it, basically do like a white balance sort of thing, and then it'll calibrate it to a more correct color. Hopefully something more pleasing to the eye. And then calibrate image sensor. If you've got any, if you need to, recalibrate your pixels on the sensor or anything, then what you do is you put the sensor cap over the camera, basically just black it out, and then hit this and it'll calibrate it, which can sometimes help with removing things like dead pixels and any kind of like artifacting that you might be getting and not knowing the reason why. And now we're coming over to the part of the menu for presets. So presets is kind of like your custom profile options. So if you've got any specific settings that you've put in this camera that you would like to save aside or import from a memory card, if you've already made them elsewhere and want to bring them into this camera because this is a new model that you've bought to go in a pair with a previous Blackmagic that you've had, then you can then this is basically your way of doing that. If you've got it on your SD card, then you can import it through here. You can just create a new thingy and you name it whatever you like, and update. I'm not going to do that right now, but that's how you do that. And then over here we've got LUTs. So these are the LUTs that are already on the camera. So by pressing this, I now can just go to the tick, and then when I go to toggle on and off my LUT preview or my LUT view assist, then this is the LUT that it will be showing me over the top of that. It'll also be the LUT that it burns into the file if you apply that option in your recording options. And that's pretty much it for the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro in terms of the menu. Just to give you a quick look at the HUD, this is what it looks like. So of course you've got like all your readings here. You can deactivate these so that you don't see all of this furniture on screen if you don't need it. Ideally, if you were having an external monitor, that would be the one where you wouldn't want any of the furniture. I always find it very handy having, all of my settings laid out in front of me on screen, so I can just double check what it is that I've input without having to dive into the camera. I hope this walkthrough was useful to you guys and gave you a look at the inner workings of this camera before your inevitable purchase of this absolute beast. But from me today, you'll be glad to know that that is it. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.